Coming up with things on the fly is often tricky, sometimes demanding, sometimes it feels as if it's impossible, and sometimes you just don't know what to do. So how do you overcome this challenge? How do you even come up with creative ideas when you're not pressed on the fly by your players, when you're just sitting trying to create your adventure? Well, there is something that we can use, and recently, or not so recently anyway, it's considered taboo to talk about. I am, of course, talking about stereotyping and profiling. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of How to Be a Great GM. My name is Guy, and today we're going to be talking about a slightly contentious issue when it comes to helping ourselves unlock and access the potential of our own creativity whilst creating exciting, engaging, and different stories and adventures for our players to go on. Now, we're going to be talking about stereotyping and profiling. And these are very serious issues on our planet, and I really wish that they didn't exist. I want to get that straight and clear out the gate. When it comes to role-playing, or when it comes to being creative, however, we can use that to deconstruct it and to break it down if we want to, but we can also use it as a means of helping to engage and entertain our player characters, I should say, by knowing what these things are, by realizing that they're there, and then by looking for the good and the bad and figuring out what to avoid whilst what to keep. The entire exercise is not to create some kind of socio-political statement within your game. That's not what I'm advocating. What I'm advocating is that part of being a GM is coming up with cool ideas, and we need as many tools as we can get our hands on to help us to come up with even better stories. So that's the tone in which this video is being made. Now, this was a request from Discord that I talk about this particular issue and how we can use it and what we should and shouldn't be doing with it. So don't shoot me. I'm just responding to your questions. That's discord.gg/greatgm if you want to join the channel. Let's jump into it. Okay, so when we're talking about stereotypes, we've got good stereotypes. We've got bad stereotypes. Good stereotypes are called role models. And that's something to bear in mind. It's like, oh, that person's a role model. They're a good person. They've got these kind of attributes. They make us want to be better. Bad role models and stereotypes by default start to pigeonhole people into spaces. Now, stereotypes exist for a very good reason. There is, in a broad sense, an accuracy to a stereotype. I'm not going to dive into all of the various stereotypes. Suffice it to say that I myself come from a various stereotyped group, and within the group, there are many stereotypes there too. And I fall into some of those stereotypes sometimes, and sometimes I don't. And it just is. I am who I am. Now, to me, if you stereotype me, I'll go, well, that's an interesting stereotype, but you know that this also happens and that also happens. And that is something that we have to focus on. Stereotypes are going to exist. All orcs are green, brutish savages. That's a stereotype. Why does the stereotype exist? Because generally speaking, whenever we encounter orcs, whether it's in World of Warcraft or in Tolkien or in Warhammer 40k or wherever the orcs come from, they have variations on a theme, but generally speaking, they're always handled as these barbaric, bloodthirsty individuals. It's a stereotype. It's a bad stereotype because if you were an orc and you wanted to be educated and you wanted to do something with your life other than raiding, pillaging, and leading wargs, you wouldn't be able to. So stereotypes are bad from that perspective because they constrain you. As a creator, though, you could create a group of orcs who've broken away and who have tried to desperately not reinvent themselves, but to embrace who they actually are, which is academic pacifists. Do you see how you can start to use the negative aspect of stereotyping to turn it into a positive story angle? Why did they become academics? Well, because they just grew up interested in that space. What challenges did they go through as juniors where they were trying to be more academic? Were their peers laughing and mocking them, as the stereotype would tell us that they would have suffered from? Or was there a certain admiration and a certain, yes, you can do it, I'm going to lead a war now, but you stay home and read? What was that situation? We can look to history for the answers to that, by the way, insofar as if we look at, say, the Greeks or the Romans, certain classes were allowed to be educated, certain classes weren't allowed to be educated. Perhaps the same thing can exist within your orcish society. So by using a base stereotype, we can then start to completely come up with something I think that's very different from the norm. Another good thing about stereotypes is that they are a shorthand. And when it comes to role-playing, we are not creating books, we're not creating movies. We have a bunch of friends sitting around a table, or as in most cases these days it seems, on some kind of social media, a video conference call thing. And our focus is not just on elaborating and, like I said, on deconstructing social norms and political commentary and all. That's not what we're there for. We're there to play a game. So sometimes stereotyping or using those stereotypes becomes a shorthand. You encounter a Klingon. Okay, well, Klingons are very much like orcs, as a matter of fact. They're bloodthirsty, violent individuals who are all about honor and look down upon anything that remotely has to do with academics. Well, that's not entirely true, because we know there are several Klingons within the Klingon society that were academics, but they were frowned upon and they were considered not particularly Klingon. Nonetheless, when you describe that, provided that your players are also aware of the stereotype that exists around Klingons, they will instantly start to form an idea and approach to this particular individual. That's a really powerful technique for you as the GM to then change things up. And that's really where the adventure, the surprise, the story comes in. Another thing to bear in mind when we are dealing with stereotypes is stereotypes really are just a form of expectation. We know that expectation is a really powerful tool within our arsenal as GMs that players expect to fight a dragon. It's a red dragon, so stereotype would indicate that the dragon is evil, it's angry, it's very red. Now, before I continue, I can already hear some of you saying, it's not a bad stereotype because the monster is chaotic evil. It is trying to destroy everything. So the stereotype, it's actually wrong to call it a stereotype, it's just a fact. That's then when we start to get into, well, how fixed is your world, and is your world basically just focused on what's written in the book, in which case there is no such thing as free will, and ultimately every creature is going to be exactly the same as the other, because unless you have a book of 20 million NPCs, your NPCs will always be the same, which I find hard to believe. So I'm not talking about, but the stats say it is, and so it is. Your world, your rules, and if you want to play like that, that's entirely your purview, and I hope you have a great game. On the other hand, if your world is created to be more of a real world, that red dragon might have rebelled against her parents when she was just a hatchling and has gone off to try and rebuild a colony to save tieflings, because the stereotype of tieflings is they're all underhanded, shady characters. I myself in my games utilize all of these stereotypes with all of the prejudices and the profiling that goes with it to make sure that some of the characters, some of the NPCs that are encountered, fulfill that stereotype. We can then start to subvert that expectation. We can start to then change it around. But we have to remember something about expectation and stereotypes. It is very cultural. So if you are privileged, like I am, to be able to play with people from all over the world who have a myriad of cultural backgrounds, you start to realize, well, this is only a stereotype in this group. In that group, it never came up. It was never a thing. Or it's the exact opposite. It's a very interesting space, and a very classic example of expectations and stereotypes and things along those lines being very cultural is in my home city of Johannesburg in South Africa. I remember that there was a particularly bad rat problem. The city administrators decided that the best way to solve a rat problem without putting down poison, which would risk other animals, to try and avoid using inhumane traps and things, was to introduce a colony of owls which I think is called a parliament of owls, actually, not a colony, a parliament of owls into this community. Now, the community itself was from a different cultural group to the city administrators, and what the city administrators didn't realize was that owls are considered omens and bringers and harbingers of death. The stereotype of owls presaging the arrival of death caused the entire community to go into an uproar, and for the Parliament of Owls to be more hated than the rats. That was a cultural misunderstanding. The expectation was that the owls will go in and they'll eat all of the rats. Meanwhile, absolutely the exact opposite happened. The owls were hunted down by the locals because they were worried about this stigma. So when we are dealing with expectations and stereotypes, one of the things you need to make sure is that everybody's on the same page. Equally so when you look at education. Now, I'm not saying that education, if you have a certificate from graduating from junior school or whether you have a PhD, I'm not talking about that kind of education. I'm talking about your exposure to different things. So, for example, when I talk about the Cardassians having a stereotype that only women go into the sciences within the Cardassian space, if you have no idea who a Cardassian is and you think you know that a Cardassian is a Cardassian, or if you are inclined to make the joke about Cardassians and Kardashians, then you probably won't get that particular reference and you won't understand why it's important. You have to make sure that when you are using these stereotypes and when you are using these expectations, that your players are on the same page, and be prepared that they're not. If they're not, you then need to step up and give them a little bit of an info dump. Well, actually, all Cardassians believe that women have a superior intellect in terms of the sciences, are more logical and analytical and less prone to making impulsive decisions. This benefits science rather than the military, for example. That is a complete little insight into the Cardassian mindset. Right or wrong, that is the situation. So you need to then have an info dump in some way or another, whether you introduce an NPC into the party who's then going to give that information, or whether you ask one of the PCs to explain their particular take on it. It's entirely up to you. There is nothing wrong as well, by the way, of taking a little step back and saying, in my world, this is the approach. Slaves cannot be female, they can only be male. So you won't be taken as slaves, you'll be chopped up and served as dinner later on. They'll be taken as slaves. It's about creating those expectations. Then later on, once you have created that expectation, you then have the evil empress who goes, I don't want to eat that one, she's too stringy. Send her to becoming a slave in the mines. That adventure is then about unpacking that whole stigma around only women can be eaten and only men can go into the slave into the mines, or vice versa. I mean, it's entirely up to you. I try and subvert expectations whenever I can, whilst at the same time also entrenching them from time to time so that they continue to exist, and more importantly, they continue to delight and amaze when they are changed up. That's the important thing to bear in mind here. So when we look at subverting or at ratcheting up our game when it comes to stereotypes and when it comes to expectation, we have three ways that I can see anyway of doing that. Now, the first way is we can invert it. We can literally make it the opposite. Women go into the mines, men get put into thongs and are forced to dance for the pleasure of the court. That's an instant subversion of the idea. It's not a new idea. Television, literature have been trying to subvert expectations and stereotypes almost since their inception. So it's nothing new to invert it. But it's still different enough and interesting enough that people at your table will go, wait, what? Yeah, that's right. You giant barbarian, there's your thong, go dance. And you, high priestess of light, you go off and you get into the mines. Do you notice how I was still using a stereotype? The big hairy male barbarian is offended by the fact that he has to go and dance, while I automatically threw the female role into being a cleric of light. Why wasn't it a cleric, a female barbarian who was gigantic, and the male who was the cleric of light? Again, that's what we've got to do. We've got to ask ourselves, where is the more interesting story? And that, for me, is really the bottom line. Where is the more interesting story? So we can invert the stereotype or the expectation. We can revert it. We can go back to its origin. So, for example, when you look at something like the idea of wearing tights. Tights was an invention primarily for men to show off their calves and their legs. Nowadays, it's almost the opposite, isn't it? So by going back to its origin, we then have to understand where did it come from, and that was, quite specifically, to point out that men had straight legs, they didn't suffer from any kind of malnutrition when they were younger, so they had good genetics, they had good genes, they could show off those legs, and that leads us to the codpiece, which was a whole different mindset altogether, and if you go and Google medieval codpieces, they weren't afraid to show what they were carrying. It was an interesting time period. And you look at that stereotype, or you look at that and you go, well, the stereotype is that those men were quite effeminate. They were to a degree, but they also had the rule that if you offended their sense of honor, they would take you out into the garden and try and cut you to pieces with a sword. There is a certain, I want to say, masculinity about that approach, dare I say it. So by going back to the origins of where the stereotype came from, you can generally start to unpack it. Another thing to do in terms of reverting the stereotype is to try and say, well, that may have been a stereotype that we knew about, but actually it's something that came from one individual who has tarred the entire space with it for all eternity. One bloodthirsty count from Transylvania, and now anyone who's from Transylvania and who happens to be an aristocrat, is that really a vampire? Meanwhile, the rest of them had absolutely nothing to do with it. So try and find the origins sometimes of stereotypes and unpack them. It's an interesting journey into armchair research, and as I maintain on this channel, the more you know, the faster your imagination will operate, because it can start to pull from all of these things. Finally, you can try and enforce it. So you can try and make it even more prominent, even more in your face. It is amazing to see how uncomfortable people get when you try and enforce certain stereotypes. And it's because we get uncomfortable that the adventure starts to become more interesting. Not every single barkeeper needs to be a male owner or an angry, stroppy female owner. We can play around with that, but sometimes we want them to be like that. We want the barkeeper, when someone walks in, to say, oh, we don't serve droids here, they must go out. We want that to show that there are these stereotypical places where there's droid phobia, or where there's this, or where there's that, or where the drow are truly, truly evil, but it's only 5 or 6 of them in the 20 that the characters will meet. So by enforcing it, you are then making it more obvious, and as a result, when you then subvert it later on, it's more of a subversion. So you can use all 3 of those: invert them, revert them, or enforce them. Play around with it and use all 3. Don't just use the one, use all 3 in a combination as best you can. So that is my take on stereotypes, on profiling, and on using the expectations that go therein in order to step back and say, this is something that we do as a species, as humans. We categorize people. We put things, well, not just people, everything gets put into categories. And we create these bizarre expectations based off of those categories. They are sometimes very bad, they're sometimes very good. They are oftentimes, I find, a very strong source of guidance and inspiration, so that we can change them up, we can enforce them, or we could use them and abuse them basically to fit our own ends. Ultimately, I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where we don't have a stereotype, but I think that by acknowledging them and using them, we can then start to defang them. So they're not negative, they're groupings, if you like, because as humans, that's what we like to do. Okay, so we haven't done this in a while because the previous videos didn't really have a lot of opportunities. Your task, haha, Your task is to take a fairy tale, choose any fairy tale you like. They are replete with stereotypes and expectations. Little Red Riding Hood goes on the journey to her grandmother. She is attacked by the evil wolf, or at least he tries to inveigle his way into her life first, but of course she resists and she gets to Grandma, where Grandma has already been eaten by the wolf, and Little Red Riding Hood is about to be eaten by the wolf when the dashing woodsman comes rushing in to save her. Stereotype, 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 stereotype. There have been films which have subverted this, where the wolf tries to seduce Little Red Riding Hood and she cuts his head off straight away. End of fable. There have been alternative versions where Little Red Riding Hood gets to her little old grandmother, the wolf is about to attack, and it's the grandmother who saves Little Red Riding Hood and the huntsman, or the woodsman, from the wolf. There are others where the wolf is the victim and has actually been set up in a tragic case of mistaken identity, and it's the huntsman who actually ate the grandmother, and Little Red Riding Hood is accusing the wolf of it. The wolf is racially profiled, or specially profiled, I should say, as the criminal and taken off to prison, and it's suddenly the whole thing changes. Do you see how by just taking all of the stereotypes, all of our expectations, and twisting them around and putting them on their heads that we go, mind blown. Same story, completely different outcomes. And so your task is to take a fairy tale and completely change it by altering, enforcing, or inverting, or reverting the stereotypes that are contained therein. I promise you, it'll be an interesting journey, and when you sit back, you'll go, wow. So if Rumpelstiltskin had come across this young man who had long hair and could weave it into gold, would that story still make sense? What is the origin of Rumpelstiltskin? Venereal disease, I think, is the original one, or unprotected sex, I'm not entirely sure. Look at that. You go, what? Where did that come from? You'd be amazed. So that's your task. If you liked today's video, you know what to do. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, of course, that would be fantastic. And if you haven't yet caught on to it, the Goblin Bell will send you alerts whenever something is happening on this channel, such as our live shows, which happen on Thursday for the next couple of weeks, as of this recording, I should say. And those live shows happen every Thursday night, and they are quite interesting. Anyway, our sponsors today are ourselves, and our beloved partners, Dungeon Fog, World Anvil, and Kaora, the cartographer. I am talking about the Circle of World Builders. Hi, Tsumanya, Baba. Well, maybe not that circle, but I am talking about the Circle of World Builders, or affectionately known as COW. COW is a one-day event that will be happening on the 5th of June. So please put that in your diaries now. Happening on the 5th of June, kicking off at 4 p.m. UTC. So that's 5 p.m. British Standard Time, or summertime, I should say, British summertime. About 11 a.m. Pacific Time, if my maths serves me correctly. It starts then. We have got World Anvil talking about how to make your campaigns awesome. We've got Kaora the cartographer talking about how to make your world maps awesome. We've got Dungeon Fog talking about how to make your battle maps awesome. And I am there, of course, talking about how to make your campaigns awesome. Now, the entire theme is creating a kick-ass campaign, aka how not to be boring. That's the entire theme for the show, and it will run for several hours, of course. We'll each be giving you insights into our various points of view on how to do that. And then at the very end, there is a raffle with some amazing prizes in that raffle for those that want to participate. It will be live on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/World Anvil, or on this channel, youtube.com/HowToBeAGreatGM. It is going to be an amazing day. So 5th of June, mark it down. It's going to be awesome. Now, if you want more information, you can head on over to the website. That's www.circleofworldbuilders.com. Circleofworldbuilders.com. Making today's video. And of course, our wonderful Patrons. You guys, without you, this channel wouldn't exist. So a massive thank you to you. And of course, as always, thank you to you for watching all the way till the end. Till next time, I wish you and yours the very happiest of gaming.